Maria woke before the first light, as she always did. The silence of her little home seemed heavier in those hours before dawn, when even the world outside was still holding its breath. She moved slowly to the window, her joints stiff with age, her eyes still swollen from the night before. The horizon was pale, soft grey against the darker sky. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for the sun that always came too late. The mornings had once been her favourite. Her husband used to rise early too, humming softly as he made coffee, smiling as he whispered her name. But now the mornings hurt. They reminded her of everything that was gone. So she cried, quietly, carefully, as though afraid to disturb the silence. Her tears fell one by one, soft as dew, unseen by anyone but God. And though she didn't know it yet, those tears were not lost. Each one was being gathered, each sigh, each silence, each small ache, by the one who had never stopped listening. There were no words for Maria's grief. She had tried to speak of it once, to a neighbor who meant well, but how could she explain a pain that had become her very breath? So she stopped speaking of it altogether. Instead, she sat each morning in her worn chair by the window, hands folded, lips closed, eyes wet. Her tears became her prayers. Every drop held a memory, his laughter, his voice, the warmth of his hands in hers. Sometimes she would whisper his name just once, just to hear it again in the air. And then, under her breath, almost without realizing it, she would add, "Lord, are you listening?" But no answer came, only the stillness of the dawn, the slow bloom of light across the sky, and the soft ache that had made a home inside her heart. Still, she kept crying, not in despair, but in longing, as if her tears themselves were knocking on heaven's door. And though she heard no reply, someone was already answering. Maria's house was quiet, but not empty. Every corner carried an echo of a life once shared, of laughter that still seemed to linger in the walls. The clock ticked softly in the living room. It was his clock, the one he used to wind every Sunday. She never wound it now, but somehow it still ran, slower, quieter but steady, as if time itself refused to abandon her. She kept his hat on the peg by the door, just as he'd left it. His Bible, open to Psalm 34, lay beside hers on the table. Sometimes she would trace her fingers along its pages, whispering the words he used to read aloud. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted." She didn't feel close to the Lord, not yet. But she held on to that verse the way a drowning person holds on to driftwood. And in that holding, in the stillness between tears and memory, heaven began to draw near, quietly, tenderly, unseen. The morning after her husband's funeral, Maria had made a promise. It wasn't loud, not spoken to anyone else, just whispered in the dark, between sobs and trembling hands. "I'll keep living," she said, "for both of us." It was a small vow, fragile as breath, but it carried her through the early days of grief. She watered his plants, kept his chair by the table, and still made coffee at dawn, just as he had. But as years passed, the promise began to feel heavy. Keeping it felt like walking uphill every day, with no end in sight. "I'm still trying," she whispered one morning. "But it's hard, Lord, so hard." She didn't know if she was talking to her husband or to God, maybe both. She just knew her words always rose into the same silence. Still, she kept her promise, not out of strength but out of love, the same love that refused to die, even when everything else had. And in that steadfastness, her faith quietly endured, waiting for the moment when love himself would speak back. Some mornings Maria tried to pray the way she used to. She would fold her hands, close her eyes, and open her mouth, but no words came. Every phrase felt too small, too empty. What could she possibly say that would change what had already been lost? So she prayed in silence, just breathing, just sitting, just being. Sometimes the only sound in the room was her sigh, but heaven understood even that. One dawn, as the first light brushed her window, she pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "You can hear me even when I can't speak, can't you?" No sound answered, yet something deep inside her shifted, a peace, fragile but real, like the first note of a song carried on the wind. She didn't understand it then, but she had begun to pray in the language that Jesus hears best. Not words, but heartbeats. The years stretched on, each one quieter than the last. Friends passed away, letters stopped coming, and her children, busy with their own lives, visited less often. Maria learned to live with solitude. She moved through her house like a ghost, dusting, tidying, tending her small garden, not because it mattered, but because it gave her something to do. She smiled when people asked how she was, saying, "I'm fine," even though fine had long since ceased to mean happy. But even in her silence, she never stopped waking before dawn. Each morning she sat by the same window, tears slipping down her face as the sun rose over the horizon. The world saw an old widow, quietly surviving. Heaven saw a woman whose every tear was being written into eternity. For love that grieves deeply is never wasted. It becomes a prayer strong enough to move the heart of God. And one morning, that prayer would finally be answered. There came a morning when Maria's heart could no longer contain the ache. It was as though every silent dawn, every unshed tear, every lonely hour had gathered within her chest, pressing outward like a cry that demanded to be heard. She rose from her chair before the sun appeared and walked to the window. The air was cool and pale, the kind of quiet that makes sound itself seem fragile. She pressed her forehead against the glass and whispered, "Please, just let me know you hear me." Her voice broke halfway through the sentence. It wasn't a demand, just a plea, trembling and small. "I don't need answers," she continued, "only to know I'm not talking into the air." Then, exhausted by her own words, she sank back into her chair, tears spilling freely. She covered her face with her hands and wept until the first light touched her fingers. What she didn't see was how that same light lingered, soft, golden, almost alive, as though pausing to listen. For God had indeed been listening all along. And soon the silence would answer her back. It happened the next morning. The sky was painted in soft blues and rose, and Maria sat in her usual place, eyes red from another sleepless night. She closed her eyes, whispering her usual silent prayer. But this time, before she could even finish it, something inside her shifted. A stillness deeper than quiet filled the room. Not emptiness, but presence, the kind that makes you afraid to move, afraid to breathe, not out of fear, but awe. And then, through that stillness, she heard it, a voice, not from the outside, not through the air, but from within, soft, gentle. "I hear you." Her heart stilled, her hands froze mid-motion. The voice wasn't her imagination, it was real. It carried peace, like fragrance, wrapping around her pain until it melted. Tears welled up, spilling freely down her face. "You heard me?" she whispered. The silence that followed was full, rich, alive. And in it, she knew the truth. Jesus had not only heard, he had been listening all along. The next dawn came brighter than any before. Maria woke early, her heart already trembling with a sense of expectation. The world outside was still wrapped in shadow, but inside her little home, something unseen was stirring. She sat in her chair, folded her hands and waited. The air around her was gentle, warm, breathing with a quiet rhythm that wasn't her own. Then in that stillness, she heard it again, the same voice, close enough to touch. Maria, her name, spoken with love, spoken with eternity in it. No one had said her name like that since her husband, but this voice carried something deeper, something that filled every empty space in her heart. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, "Lord, is it really you?" And the answer came, soft as dawn itself. "I have always been here. Every tear you shed, I held. Every silence you feared, I filled." She wept without restraint, her heart finally breaking open, not from pain, but from love that had finally spoken. In that moment, Maria realized that she had never prayed alone. Her silence had always been a duet. After that morning, everything felt different. The walls of her house, once so silent, now seemed to hum softly with unseen life. The light through her window felt warmer, almost like it lingered to touch her face. Maria could no longer see the emptiness the same way. Wherever she looked, the chair where her husband once sat, the table where she had eaten alone, she felt something there. Someone. She didn't see him, but his presence was unmistakable. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was quiet, like peace taking form, sitting beside her in the small hours. Each dawn, when she rose, she didn't weep right away. She simply sat, breathed and whispered, "You're here, aren't you?" And every time the stillness seemed to answer, not in sound, but in peace so deep it felt like a reply. The loneliness hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled her. Jesus was near, and his nearness was enough. One morning, as light poured through her thin curtains, Maria closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared speak before. "Lord," she said softly, "if you're here, if you've really heard me all this time, then don't just comfort me, teach me how to live again." It was the first time her prayer wasn't about the past. It was about what might still come. For a moment the air grew still again, that holy, living stillness that had become familiar. Then came a whisper, not outside her, but deep within her chest. "Then love again." She frowned, tears gathering. "Love? But who, Lord? I have no one left." The answer came with gentle strength. "There is always someone who needs what you have to give." She wept quietly, her hand pressed over her heart. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew this. Her prayer had been heard, not just heard, but answered. It was the beginning of something new. That day, when the sun rose, Maria didn't stay by her window. She stood up, took her shawl, and walked outside for the first time in weeks. The morning air was cool and fresh. Birds sang in the trees, and she felt the warmth of sunlight on her skin, not as something distant, but as something given. She smiled faintly. The ache in her chest was still there, but it didn't hurt the same way. It had softened, like a wound finally beginning to heal. As she walked down the street, a little girl waved to her from a porch. Maria hesitated, then waved back. The girl ran over, handing her a small daisy. "This is for you," she said. Maria knelt slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing the girl's hair. When the child ran off again, Maria looked up toward the sky. "I see," she murmured. "You're teaching me." The light around her seemed to brighten, wrapping her in warmth, and for the first time in years, Maria smiled at the morning. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Maria still rose before dawn, but now her tears had changed. No longer cries of sorrow, but tears of quiet gratitude. Each morning she walked through her garden, touching the small plants she'd nearly forgotten to care for. The dew sparkled on the leaves like tiny reminders of grace. "You water even these," she whispered, "just as you've watered my heart." Her grief hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. The pain had become prayer. The emptiness had become space for God to dwell. Sometimes she still felt the old ache creeping in, the whisper of loneliness returning like a shadow. But now she knew what to do. She would sit, close her eyes and say, "I know you're here." And every time she did, peace came, not as a feeling, but as presence. Her faith no longer needed proof. It had become a steady walk, not by sight, but by quiet knowing. Maria began to notice small things she had once missed, the way sunlight poured across her kitchen table, the laughter of children outside, the sound of her own breathing, steady and strong. Peace had settled in her home like a soft blanket. It didn't erase her loss. It filled it. Every place that once hurt now held warmth instead. She kept her husband's Bible open beside her chair, reading a few verses each morning. One day she found herself at John 14:27. "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you." She read it aloud, her voice trembling. "You really did give it, didn't you?" The air around her grew still again, the same stillness she had come to recognize, and in it she felt that familiar whisper inside her heart. It was always yours. Tears fell freely again, but these were not tears of pain. They were the kind that fall when a soul finally rests. Maria leaned back in her chair, her hand over her heart. Her house was no longer empty. It was full of peace, of memory, of him. But even peace has its trials. One night, a storm rolled through, wind howling, rain striking against her windows. The lights flickered, and Maria's old fear returned without warning. The same feeling she'd known in the first nights of her widowhood, the panic of being alone, began to claw its way back. Her heart raced. She tried to pray, but her lips only trembled. The thunder roared outside, and she whispered through tears, "Don't leave me now. Not now." Then, amid the storm's noise, something happened. A memory, no, more than that, a presence. Soft and sure, the voice came again within her heart. "I never left." Maria froze, the tears halting mid-breath. The fear, so strong just moments before, melted into calm. The storm still raged outside, but inside her all was still. She sat in silence, eyes closed, whispering only one word again and again: "Thank you." And when she finally fell asleep, the rain on her roof sounded not like thunder anymore, but like hands gently keeping rhythm with her heartbeat. As the weeks passed, people began to notice something different about Maria. Her face, though still lined by years and sorrow, carried a calmness that drew others near. There was a light in her eyes, gentle, steady, and kind. One morning, a young widow from down the street came to visit. She had heard of Maria's kindness and wanted to talk, though she could barely find the strength to speak. Maria listened quietly as the woman wept, her pain raw and familiar. When the tears slowed, Maria reached across the table, taking her trembling hands into her own. "You're not alone," she said softly. "I thought I was once too, but Jesus sat right here with me. He'll do the same for you." The young widow cried harder, but this time the tears carried relief. Maria smiled through her own, whispering, "He hears us, even when we can't find the words." From that day forward, others began to come, the lonely, the grieving, the forgotten. And every time Maria shared her story, peace seemed to fill the room again. What once was her burden had become her gift. The comfort she received, she now gave away. One dawn, as she sat in her chair watching the sunrise, Maria felt an unfamiliar stillness, deeper than usual, tender but final, like the world itself was exhaling. Her body was tired, her breath slower, her thoughts quiet. She smiled faintly, realizing what was happening. So, it's time. She didn't feel fear. She felt invitation. The same voice that had whispered to her through the years spoke again, gentle and familiar. "Rest now. You've been heard." Tears filled her eyes, but they were warm, peaceful. "You really never forgot me," she whispered. "Not for a moment." Her gaze moved to her husband's old Bible on the table. She reached for it, running her hand over the worn leather. "I'm coming home," she said softly, smiling through her tears. The light through her window seemed to glow brighter, wrapping around her like a golden veil. And as she leaned back in her chair, she whispered one last prayer. "Thank you for hearing me, even when I had no voice." The morning came slowly. A soft wind moved through her curtains, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Birds sang gently outside her window. Maria's eyes were closed, her face serene. She looked as though she was simply resting, her hands folded over her heart, her Bible open beside her. But something in the room had changed. The air was lighter, warmer, alive with quiet peace. The same presence that once sat with her in grief now filled the whole house with glory. If anyone had been there, they might have heard it, the faintest whisper echoing through the stillness. "Well done, beloved. I've heard every cry." Maria's soul slipped gently into that light, leaving behind only the echo of her faith, the kind of peace that remains when words are no longer needed. The woman who once cried silently at every dawn had been heard. Now her mornings would never end. When the neighbor came that morning to bring Maria her bread, the house was quiet, but not in the usual way. The silence was gentle, almost sacred, like the air inside a chapel. The candle by her chair had burned down to its end, and the soft light of dawn filled the room. Maria sat where she always did, hands folded, her Bible open to Psalm 34, the same verse she had clung to all her life. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted." Clara, the neighbor, knelt beside her and touched her hand. It was still warm. Tears rose in her eyes as she whispered, "He was close, wasn't he?" And she knew. Maria hadn't died in sorrow or fear or silence. She had gone home in conversation. Her face was calm, her lips curved in the faintest smile. It was as if she had heard something in those final moments, a voice promising once again, "I am here, and I always will be." The room glowed softly, as if that voice still lingered. Maria's life had ended the way her prayers had begun, quietly but completely heard. In that little house, the mornings never truly ended. The sunlight still touched the same window, the same table, the same worn chair. But now something lingered, a peace too deep to explain. Clara often came to sit there, just as Maria had, hands folded in her lap, listening to the silence. Sometimes she thought she heard it, a faint whisper, not of words, but of presence. "I hear you." She smiled through her tears, realizing that the conversation had never stopped. It had only grown wider. What had begun as one widow's cry in the dark had become an unending dialogue between heaven and earth, and those who entered that quiet home found themselves changed. They felt seen, heard, known, because Maria's prayers had not died with her. They had taken root, in the walls, in the air, in the hearts of those who would come after. The woman who once cried silently at every dawn had become a melody of peace, a living promise that no heart ever weeps unheard, for Jesus listens still, and in the silence of the soul his answer always comes.